It's my very distinct honor and pleasure to introduce my good friend and excellent Lincoln scholar, Gabor Boritt, who is the Robert C. Fluhrer Professor of Civil War Studies at Gettysburg College and the director of the Civil War Institute at that college. Professor Boritt was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1940 and came to this country after having participated in the revolt against Soviet domination of his homeland. He came here and was educated at Yankton College, from which he graduated in 1962. In 1963, he received his master's degree from South Dakota University, and in 1968, his PhD from Boston University. There he studied under the distinguished historian Robert V. Bruce, the author of Lincoln and the Tools of War, and the winner of a Pulitzer Prize in History. Professor Boritt is the author, co-author, and editor of 16 books dealing with Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War era. His first book is called Lincoln and the Economics of the American Dream, which is a trailblazing study of Lincoln's economic thought. His latest book is Gettysburg Gospel, the Lincoln speech nobody knows, which is an examination revealing fresh insights into that remarkable address. And on a personal note, I would like to say that I have been a warm friend of Gabor's for the past 16 years. He was instrumental in helping me get my first book published back in 1994, and has, with his gracious wife Liz, entertained me often at their delightful home in Gettysburg. My family and his are connected by more than a passion for Lincoln. The eldest son of the Boritts, Norse, was a prize student of my brother's at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts and is now a highly successful stage designer in New York. Their youngest son, Daniel, works here as a biologist at the National Zoo and recently spent 3 months in Antarctica. And their middle son is an accomplished documentary filmmaker whose handiwork you will soon see following Professor Boritt's remarks, which are abbreviated because he is recuperating from a bout of ill health. Please join me in welcoming Gabor Boritt.
Thanks for having me here. My middle son, Jake, is helping us along the way, and he may help me again. In fact, I asked to begin my few words by asking him to say, to read to me a few words if he's available. You can probably stand up. I guess we are not all organized as well as we should be, but we'll do it.
Gettysburg, July 4th, 1863. Dreadful silence. It rains. People crawl out of their cellars, blinking in the gloomy light, trying to find their neighbors. Food, news, life. Strange, awful odors overpower the air and seem to be growing, trying to imprison all in an unbearable stench. Dead bodies are scattered over the streets, dead horses and mules. When the oppressive hush breaks, the clatter comes not from rifles or cannon fire to salute Independence Day, but in dead earnest by enemy armies still facing each other at the edge of town. No toasts are offered today, no fireworks, no parades, no services in churches that are filling up with grievously wounded men. Gettysburg, July 4th, 1863. But Sally Myers, 23, full of life, forges ahead. The sun comes out, and in a free moment, she'll write in her diary, "I never spent a happier 4th. It seemed so bright." The Union had retaken the town. A soldier will later add, "The glorious 4th, and we are still a nation, and shall most likely continue to be for centuries to come." Professor Michael Jacobs comes out of his house on Middle Street with his son Henry. So do others. A band marches down Baltimore Street, fife and drum breaking the noxious grip of stillness. people moved towards the square.
Thank you. As you can see, I can use my son who does a better job than I can, or talk about things better than he does. The book begins with July 4th, 1863. And that's the book goes on until the month of the July 4th for November 2009. I hope I'm not making mistakes. In any case, I would like to begin where the Gettysburg Address comes from. The ideas of the Gettysburg Address, as I understand it, are ideas that people have studied for a generation, probably more. Most of the ideas that we know as the Gettysburg Address can be put together, pieces here and there, all of it. Nothing that's in that speech is unusual, except the way it is told. Lincoln himself had the same ideas well before November 19, 1863. He used some of the very words before the Gettysburg Address. You can find them yourself. What we do not have, what we did not have, is the exact words, the expressions that come from November 19, 1863. And these are words that he put together that's amazing, a moment where his genius grew. I'm going into some details about a small part because they're important to me and may or may not be useful to you and may be meaningful to you. As I understand it, what we call as the Gettysburg Address had not become until 2 or 3 days before the actual Gettysburg Address. We have heard, and I have a sheet that I would hand around because many of you hear it and many of you would agree with it, that right after July 4th, Abraham Lincoln gives a brief talk off the cuff about what happened after the battle here in July 4th. And the speech is lovely, and people make it into be, and many of you probably do, that because of that speech, off-the-cuff speech, Lincoln was ready to give the Gettysburg Address. I doubt it. There's no evidence of it. If you read of it's wonderful to hear it otherwise, but I can't see it. What I see is Lincoln talking about July 4th. The first part of his speech is really about two interesting people. John. What they talk about is Thomas Jefferson and John Hay. Two very interesting men. They are quite interesting to Abraham Lincoln. That's what he talks about for the first half of the speech. He talks about July 4th, how interesting it was, how amazing it was, how after 50 years exactly of July 4th, the people, both of them die. And he goes back to the beginning of July 4th that way. And then he talks about how the victory was important for both Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and how that would be nice to have a speech about this, but of course there is no time, or he has an interest. He didn't give many speeches at all, really. He gave only, as I understand, only four specific speeches after the beginning of his presidency. And the speeches that he gave off the cuff, maybe a dozen and few more perhaps, as you're going to decide these speeches to be calling them speeches. So it seems to me he has no idea about giving the Gettysburg Address. Nobody does. I also think that historians are confusing. We all are confusing people. One of my favorite people is Copernicus, a brilliant man who for centuries talked about how history can be made simple, how historians studied the planets century after century after century, became so complex, so involved, that in the end, nobody understood what it all meant. Copernicus went ahead and he simply pulled together the idea of the planets, and so it had to us ever since. My brother Adam is a neurologist, is a whole lot smarter than ever was, and he kept telling me, be simple. To be a medical person, be simple. Don't get into all the mixtures. Get it through into it. Get to the center of it. Get to be specific. Don't get into all to the mess. See what you can find. Get to the point. He helped me that. I think historians themselves are often more complex than they need to be, in my opinion. I got to be old enough to say my own words. How much time do we have here? Nobody tells. Well, I'll finish up best I can. So back to Abraham Lincoln. It seems to me that off-the-cuff remarks of Lincoln about Vicksburg and Gettysburg had nothing to do, or not much to do, as I understand it, about the Gettysburg Address. You cannot find a single word that Abraham Lincoln said about the Gettysburg Address 2 days before the beginning of the Gettysburg Address. In fact, he did not know he would give the Gettysburg Address. Perhaps he wanted to, perhaps he didn't want to. Perhaps he wanted to, but we don't know. We simply do not know. There's no specific about any of this. Or so it seems to me. And of course I can be mistaken. Edward Everett, who was the speaker in Gettysburg, who was the host, 5 or 6 days before, writes a speech to the Secretary of State Seward. And he writes him a letter saying that you will have to speak at Gettysburg because the president, we don't know whether he's coming or not. We have the letter that he wrote ahead of time. Lincoln himself evidently, or rather, Seward actually wanted to be the speaker. And when he turned out to be not the speaker at the very end, he didn't like that. In the fact, his speech became part of the volume that included the Gettysburg Address. Seward wanted to be the speaker. As for Abraham Lincoln, as I best understand it, as others would have said, that Lincoln. Let me back up. How does he become the Gettysburg speaker? How does he end up speaking? As Clay wrote about this, and I think he's probably as realistic as any of us can be. None of us can be perfect. He expected that he didn't know when the speech was done, but he saw a version of the speech on the day of his actual speech in November 19, 1863. David Wills, his host, for the rest of his life maintained that he heard the speech taught him in Gettysburg. Well, he was the host, and he may or may not be right. None of us know for sure. Nobody said it right afterwards. The first time that speech appeared took about 4 or 5 years later. And again, he was the host who may or may not have told the truth. He was excited about the fact that he could be the host of the Gettysburg Address. His words would be important. So maybe he heard the speech ahead of time, or maybe he did not. The person I do like the most among all the people who said they heard the speech, what happened at Gettysburg, is a man named James Seward, the Attorney General. He did not attend the Gettysburg Address in person. He didn't he does not come a year later, until 1864. And some years later, he said this, and I think he's the most honest member about all I heard. And I'm saying this, I'm not saying myself, but I'm really calling him James Mers. Difficulties sometimes come before me. Mers, he's the librarian of Congress. He was probably the finest scholar in the whole field. James said the same things as I did, that James Speed heard from Lincoln that he heard the speech the night before of the Gettysburg Address. The next day it was commented. That he read all of it. Abraham Lincoln took it himself. And how Lincoln told Speed is that Lincoln heard the speech the night before in person, and then the copy was made of it. He gave that speech twice. Everybody else who talked about it are less useful, in my opinion. We can be less certain about all this. I give you a number of people of names who may have talked about Abraham Lincoln. Some people claim they heard it weeks ahead of time. I doubt it. Whether it is Brooks or Lamont or some others, there's no evidence whatsoever. I highly doubt what Brooks said about these things. Burns again said it was baloney, what Burns said. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. If he's heard anything about the Gettysburg Address by him ahead of time, it had to be 1 or 2 days before, which is possible. The same goes for Lamont. As for other people, I don't believe any of it whatsoever, who talked about they heard the Gettysburg Address ahead of time. What they heard was a moment of genius, not something that he wrote way ahead. So it seems to me. Others who talked about the speech, Governor Curtin from Massachusetts, he may have told that he heard the speech ahead of time. He claimed afterwards, years and years later, how he heard the speech. Well, if he did, he could have that night, the night before. I'm kind of dubious even about that, but if he did, so what? It doesn't make any difference. The man came to Gettysburg with 7 or 8 major speakers, governors, and that train got lost. Actually, he couldn't come to Gettysburg until the night before. Probably maybe as close as midnight behind. He came, and did he went to see Abraham Lincoln and went upstairs and listened to Abraham Lincoln's speech? I doubt it. What we do know about him is that he came here there were almost almost 40 people had to be among the people who had to give the speech. I beg your pardon, had to sleep. I make mistakes. These people had to sit in their home, and then he slept at home. And there were no places to sleep. Every house in the Wills house was held by many people. The governor himself has no place to sleep. He was not able to sleep at all. His host, Wills, didn't know where to put the governor. And so he looked at Abraham Lincoln and then looked at Everett. Those were the only places where there were more than one people in the house. All of them had their own places, was Lincoln and Everett. And the host finally decided that Everett should sleep there, because Abraham Lincoln, after was the President of the United States, should have his own room. And Everett, the speaker, didn't like the idea at all. After all, he was almost 70 years old. He had a stroke. He had a major issue with other issues as well. He couldn't go to the bathroom, forgive me for saying that. He didn't want anybody to stay with him that night. He was going to be all night with another man, and he was very angry about it. And finally, Mr. Everett, he simply had to leave. We still don't know where he slept that year. There were others. I have a whole list of people who all claim to remember about Abraham Lincoln. Andrew Carnegie is one example of it. Andrew Carnegie was a young man. I have to finish. I have to finish up. So I'll finish up quickly. One of my favorite people is a Hungarian general who claimed to, for the rest of his life, claimed that he held Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address right here. Well, he wasn't there. It simply wasn't there. It was just a wonderful thing. And I can go on again and again and again with people. We simply have no facts about any of this. I need to finish up, so let me say, these are important to me, so I'm going to say my piece about it. After Lincoln's death, the Emancipation Proclamation became the great American document. If you look at the monuments about Abraham Lincoln, if I remember right, there were probably 20, 25 of those. Nearly all of them was about the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation became the American gospel. Not until we come to the later part of the 19th century, the Gettysburg Address begins to change. We do not have a painting of Abraham Lincoln, no painting at all until the 20th century. And so it continues. Abraham Lincoln was a great man. As I understand it, what he did was he had a moment of genius. His ideas were around for a long time, but the Gettysburg Address itself came in at the most 2 days before the Gettysburg Address. Well, thanks so much.